They don't write songs about the kind of evil that hides behind money and power. Not out here. Not under this sun, out here. It's silent, quiet like a coffin. And when something bad happens, it don't scream. It just arrives, uninvited, and it waits for someone fool enough to open the door. That morning, Caleb Thorne opened the door. It was a dry, heavy dawn in Tombstone, Arizona. Caleb stepped outside, coffee in hand, and the old wood creaking under his boots. The land stretched quiet in every direction, not a single wind blowing. He had come out to check on the livestock, but what caught his eye wasn't a stray cow. It was a wagon, small, old, and left near the fence. No driver, no tracks, just dust and heat. A mule stood tied to the post, chewing at nothing, like it had been waiting too long, and in the back of that wagon, under a torn canvas, was something or someone. There was a note, tucked into the knot of rope, paid in full. Property delivered. Caleb narrowed his eyes. He hadn't ordered anything, and even if he had, no man sends property without a name or a knock. He stepped closer. The smell hit first sweat, blood, old fear. He pulled the canvas back, slowly. There she was, a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, filthy, bruised, breathing shallow like her lungs weren't sure they wanted to keep going. Her wrists were tied, her lips cracked, and across her back, just barely visible, were deep, angry scars. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him like someone who'd already lived through death, and she whispered, "You paid for me. Now finish it." Caleb didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even flinch. He just stared. Because the truth is, some men fight wars and think they've seen hell, but hell ain't a battlefield. Hell is a human being dropped off at your door, carved up and left to rot, while somebody out there thinks they've done you a favor. He untied her wrist, carried her inside, set her down gently in the corner room, and for the first time in years, Caleb Thorne didn't know what to do next. But if you think this is just a story about a girl left at a stranger's doorstep, you haven't seen what she's carrying with her. Eliza didn't speak much the first few days. She slept like someone afraid to close their eyes too long. Caleb didn't push. He'd been around silence enough to know it had its own rhythm. Some men asked too many questions. He wasn't one of them. Instead, he kept her warm, left food where she could reach it. Fresh water in a tin cup by the bed, never once crossed the room unless she was asleep or in need. That kind of quiet takes patience, and maybe a little guilt, too. He'd seen those scars again when he changed her bandage, the way they curved down her back, deep and deliberate. It wasn't random. Somebody had taken their time with her, like they were trying to write something. Caleb didn't ask, but he saw the way her shoulders tensed every time she heard boots on wood. On the third night, she sat up without his help. Didn't say a word, just stared into the fire like she was waiting for it to talk back. Caleb sat nearby, sipping on his coffee. After a while, she said it, soft and tired. "You didn't touch me." He looked up, just nodded. Most men would have. Caleb tossed another log into the fire. His voice was low, like he was talking to himself more than her. "I ain't most men." That was it. No long speeches, no soft music, just that. Over the next week, she started helping around the place, brushed the horses, cleaned up dishes without being asked. One morning, Caleb caught her humming, not a tune he recognized, but it was a sound, a real sound, from someone who had been nothing but silent. And in that moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about feeding a wounded stranger. It was about watching a soul climb back up from the edge of a hole nobody saw but her. But if you think healing is a straight path, you better buckle up, because what she's about to share is going to turn everything upside down. By the second week, the silence broke. It wasn't over supper, and it wasn't in the daylight. It came late, when the fire burned low and the coyotes had gone quiet. Eliza's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried like a bullet. She told Caleb what had happened. Not all of it, just enough. Enough to make his jaw tighten. She had worked in the big house of the county official. Clean clothes, long hours, but decent enough at first. Then came the gambling, the debts, and when he couldn't pay, He used her like a poker chip, a bet he could afford to lose. One night she was hauled out, tied up, and branded by the very men who should have been upholding the law. That scar on her back, it wasn't random. It was a word carved with a knife. Worthless. Caleb didn't answer. He just stared at the fire. But inside, something boiled. He'd fought in wars, seen men gutted and left in the dirt, but nothing stuck like this. This wasn't war. This was cowardice, and it was happening under the flag he once bled for. Liza looked at him then, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he didn't. He only stood, walked outside, and when he came back, there was ink on his fingers and a letter on the table. A letter to an old army friend in Tucson who now carried some weight in the garrison. Caleb didn't need guns or fists. He needed proof. And Eliza's scars were proof enough. For the first time, she saw a flicker of hope, not a smile, not laughter, but the simple fact that someone believed her pain was worth writing down. That was a start. Now, I know folks watching this might be thinking, where does it go from here? And if you're still with me, chances are you want to know just how far Caleb's quiet rage will take him, and what that will mean for Eliza's fight to find herself again. That's the kind of story we tell here. And if you don't want to miss the rest, you might think about hitting that subscribe button. Keeps you at the fire with us, and believe me, the fire's about to get hotter. A week later, the desert gave them a visitor, not the kind that knocks polite on the door. This one rode in close to sundown, dust rising behind his horse, hat pulled low, the kind of man you know to keep your eyes on. Caleb spotted him from the porch, and before the man even dismounted, Caleb felt that old tension crawl back into his chest. Trouble had a way of showing itself without saying a word. The man called out like he owned the place, asking if the delivery had been received. He didn't use her name. He didn't even call her a woman. Just the delivery. That was enough to make Caleb's jaw tighten. He leaned on the post, kept his hand loose near his hip, but didn't draw. The man stepped down, boots hitting dirt hard, and his eyes flicked toward the cabin window. Liza was inside, watching through the cracks, her breath short, shoulders shaking. Caleb offered him no welcome. Just stood there in that quiet way he had, waiting for the stranger to make his move. And he did. The man said he was here to collect what wasn't his to begin with. He stepped toward the door. That was when Caleb moved. No shouting, no show, just a sharp step forward, his fist on the man's collar, the other hand pressing cold steel under his chin. The fight didn't last long. It didn't need to. Caleb wasn't looking to kill, only to end it quick. Within moments, the man was on the floor of the cabin, wrists bound with rope, gag shoved in tight. Liza didn't cheer, didn't smile. She just sat by the corner, watching in disbelief as someone finally stood between her and the men who treated her life like a coin to be tossed. Caleb dragged the stranger out, tied him to the post, and waited for dawn. The desert has a way of punishing arrogance. Men come thinking they can take what they want, but out here, the land and the silence always collect their debt. He knew soldiers from Tucson would be passing through soon, and they would get their proof, flesh and blood this time, not just a letter. Now, if you think that one man tied to a post ends the story, you might want to hold tight, because when power is challenged, it doesn't just sit quiet, it bites back, and that bite was already on its way. When dawn came, the soldiers from Tucson rode in, dust cloud trailing behind them. Caleb handed over the man bound to the post, along with the letter he'd written days before. They took him without question, the weight of his guilt written all over his face. Eliza stood in the doorway, watching as the horseman disappeared into the horizon. And for the first time she realized the fight was no longer hers alone to carry. Somebody had stood with her, and the world had finally listened. The days that followed were different. There was no more waiting for boots at the door or shadows on the porch. She cooked, she worked the land. She even laughed once or twice, surprising herself as much as Caleb. He didn't say much, just went about his chores, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was a kind of peace. One evening she sat by the fire, the same place she'd once whispered that broken plea, and she told Caleb she wanted to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was the first place that had given her a choice. Caleb didn't reply right away. He just nodded slow, the kind of nod that meant more than a dozen words. Out on that ranch, miles away from the noise of politics and greed, Two people learned that healing doesn't always come in thunder or blood. Sometimes it comes quiet, in the sound of water boiling on the stove, in a scar that doesn't ache as much, in a man who chooses to listen instead of demand. Maybe that's what we forget too often. That sometimes the greatest strength is not in drawing a gun, but in choosing kindness when the world expects cruelty. And maybe the scars we carry, no matter how deep, are not the end of our story, but the proof we kept walking. Now let me ask you this. If you were in Caleb's boots, would you have opened that canvas? Would you have carried her inside, or would you have looked away, like so many do? If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It keeps you right here with us, where stories of the Old West remind us not only of who we were, but who we can still choose to be. Because in the end, the West was never just about land and guns. It was about people, broken and brave, but finding a way to keep going.